time for another book video, and today's video I'm going to be talking about Mackenzi Lee's Marvel trilogy. Mackenzi Lee, who gave us A Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy and A Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue, and there's another one in that series, but I can't think of the title right now. I haven't read these yet, so I guess we'll get back to them. But Mackenzi Lee was hired by Marvel to write 3 books about Marvel anti-heroes. So the first one's about Loki, the second one is about Gamora and Nebula, and the third one is about the Winter Soldier. These are all YA novels that take a look at these characters when they were teenagers, before they became the characters that we know in Marvel. So the first one, Loki, Where Mischief Lies, takes place when Loki was the equivalent of a teenager, because I guess in Asgard's standards he was like several hundred years old at this point. Did Loki like ever stop being a teenager? So in this book he has to travel to Earth into Victorian London in order to solve what appears to be a Jack the Ripper-esque series of murders, which turns into a tale of zombies. He learns some stuff about himself, about friendship, about what his destiny has in store for him, and also has to face a rather important decision. What I thought was really good about this book is, first of all, it's super fun. First of all, just having a kind of young Loki flapping between good and evil in Victorian London with magic and seances and zombies. What's not to like? At the beginning of this book, the gods of Asgard, so Loki's parents, are given a vision of Loki leading an army of the undead on Asgard, and this is like, oh god, is he gonna attack us? Is he gonna build an army to fight against us? And what I found interesting about this was this not only reflects the Loki that we have in the Marvel and the MCU, it also kind of reflects Norse mythology as well, because one of the, I think, probably most famous stories in Norse mythology is the story of Fenrir, or Fenris, who was one of Loki's children. That's Loki, the Norse god. We also get a version of Fenrir in the Marvel comic books and also in the MCU, where he serves as Hela's sidekick, I guess. Hela, of course, who is played by Cate Banchett, so get down on your knees and worship. He was this giant wolf, and the gods were warned about him that he would eventually bring on Ragnarok, the end of days. So they decided to take action in order to prevent this from happening by making a chain that would bind him and he was impossible to break. By doing this, this is what drove Fenris to bring on Ragnarok. So it's by trying to avoid the thing that they fear that they actually find themselves creating it. And I think this book very much reflects that, because obviously knowing Loki's story as we do, as comic book readers and as MCU fans, or at least the olden days MCU fans, this book leaves a lot of room to maneuver, as it were, and room to explain maybe why Loki ended up being the way he was. So it's not like the best novel I've ever read. It is pretty basic stories, pretty basic plot, pretty basic characters, but it's serviceable, and I definitely enjoyed it. So Loki, Where Mischief Lies. The second book is Gamora and Nebula, Sisters in Arms. So a completely different context. This book takes place on a abstract mining planet, and Mackenzi Lee gives us this very much sort of steampunk / western ambiance to it, which I found particularly pleasing. And Gamora and Nebula, who have both sent on this mission separately, they have to go and collect the heart of the planet, but they have to decide whether or not they should unite as sisters and become stronger than their father Thanos, or whether they should both go their own ways. So there's a lot of at them being allies, and then them being against each other, and then being allies again. We get a lot of Nebula's resentment towards Gamora, which is like always an omnipresent thing with her character. But it's also very obvious that Gamora really loves her and does consider her to be her sister. It gives this very like interesting dynamic with a lot of introspection with the both characters and how they feel about the relationship and how they feel about being raised by Thanos and how they feel about the world that they evolve in and what they are being asked to do, even though they are ridiculously young but have grown up in this stupidly violent environment, and they are essentially weapons, like a means to an end, and not really considered as people, and how they're going to come to terms with this. I didn't mention this about Loki, but for both Loki and this book, I didn't feel like it was really 100% necessary to have like read any of the Marvel comics or seen any of the movies. You kind of need a tiny bit of context, like maybe for Loki you need to know that he's from Asgard and that he's not an actual god, that he's a frost giant who was adopted by Odin. And for this book, I guess it's kind of useful to know who Thanos is, maybe who the Grand Master is as well, because he like appears in this book, but like it's not that important. Like you can read these two books without really knowing all the context, which I also thought was pretty interesting. So Gamora and Nebula, super fun, Western, flies around all over the place. There's some a really interesting dynamic between the two sisters, which I also found rather pleasing. Again, it's not like a super brilliant best novel you'll ever read, but again, very serviceable and super fun and exciting, and just like Western style galaxy jumping aliens. What's not to like? And the third book is The Winter Soldier Cold Front. Now, this is the book that I was most anticipating, because Mackenzi Lee said in an interview that the Winter Soldier was her favourite Marvel character. So I kind of assumed that she was going to pour her heart out in this one and give it her all, and that it was going to be wonderful and brilliant. Yeah. Bucky Barnes, she did you a disservice. I'm sorry. Yeah, this book was ultimately the one that I was the most disappointed by. So this book, unlike the other two, has two timelines to it. So the first one is in 1941 when Bucky Barnes was 16 years old, so a teenager. The other one is in 1954 when he has been through the Winter Soldier conditioning and he has become the killing machine that the Russians meant him to be. I was really interested to see what Mackenzi Lee was going to do with this character, because like it's easy to make like a kind of teenage story about Loki because he's a god and he lives on Asgard, and there's like always going to be interesting things that you can do in a world with magic and gods and, you know, playing around with Norse mythology and that. The same thing for Gamora and Nebula. These are aliens that come from outer space, so there's a lot you can play with. But with Bucky Barnes, however, having a teenage Bucky Barnes, he would just have been a kid who like grew up somewhere in the United States, so unless something horrific happened to him when he was 16, then it wasn't going to be that interesting. Like, maybe not like it wouldn't be that interesting, but like, not to say that writing a book about a 16-year-old human isn't interesting, but in the context of this extended universe, then it's going to be a bit more of a challenge. So she divided it into two timelines, one that kind of reflects the other. So when he's 16, he desperately wants to join the army, and he eventually gets drafted into a spy organization where he discovers some secrets, like, don't cause him to get involved with the Winter Soldier program, but like that answer some questions. Like, we get the serum, like the memory altering serum, we get the reasoning behind like the super soldier projects in different countries, like Captain America in the USA and in the UK, and now the Russians, who believe that in order to have the perfect soldier, you have to like completely wipe their memories and just make them an empty shell, essentially, that will just obey every order. The problem with this is, unlike the other two books, you kind of have to know who Bucky Barnes is and what he's been through to get to this point, especially Bucky Barnes from the comic books. I guess you could kind of glean the context from the movies, like the 5.5 minutes of screen time that he gets in the movies, but like the story that she went with of like the origin of Bucky Barnes and the accident that he had that led to the British thinking that he was dead is the version that's in the comic books, not the version that's in the movies. So yeah, it is very much comic book Bucky Barnes here. Unlike the other two books where you could just like tie in both comic books and movies, it didn't really matter. The other issue with this book is it's way too short. Like it felt like she really tried to take something like a story that was so complex and that like goes on for such a long period of time with so many things going on in the background and so many people and so much stuff being involved, and cram it into a 400-page novel. And it leads to a book that is full of plot holes, that doesn't really make any sense, with characters that don't really go anywhere. Like, he meets this girl called Imogen Fleming, who is the daughter of the man who invented the like memory erasure serum to cure shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder. And he like gets it. She's obviously being hunted down by the state, by the government, who want her serum, and he's trying to save her and get her away. But then she just like gets on a plane and flies away, and it's hinted that they have this whole relationship later on, but we don't know how or why. And then he meets her again as the Winter Soldier, so she recognizes him and he doesn't know who the hell she is. It also gets really confusing. Like, if you don't know that he's constantly getting his memory wiped, obviously that's the whole point. Like, ends up figuring out, because, you know, things are happening and people recognize him and he doesn't know who the hell they are, and he's got injuries and can't remember where they came from. And he ends up like piecing all of these things together and realizing that he's having his memory wiped again and again and again. It's like, if you don't kind of already know that, like, I guess it could be like the moment of revelation at the end. But like, it can get very confusing if you don't know that. I got confused, and I know the full story of Bucky Barnes. So like, yeah, for someone who's completely unaware of this character and completely unaware of the world he evolves in and what he's been through, it can get weird. Unfortunately, we don't really learn anything about the character. Like, unlike the other two books, as I said, they were super fun, they were really entertaining. This book a lot of stuff happens in it, but at the end, it doesn't really mean anything. Like, it doesn't go anywhere. So like, we just got 400 pages of story that kind of just end in, well, he ends up figuring out that he's constantly having his memory erased. Yeah, but like, we already know that. So yeah, I didn't feel that this book added anything to the character, and it was the one that really disappointed me the most. The one thing that I did like about this book, though, was all the scenes where he is, like the 1954 scene, so he is the Winter Soldier, but he still retains a certain amount of his personality. So all the, like, scenes that he has with his handler, everything that involves her, he still has this kind of sparkly personality to him, even though he's this brainwashed killing machine. Like, those scenes I found really interesting. But I was very, very disappointed that this was like what came out of Mackenzi Lee pouring her heart and soul into her favourite Marvel character. I was extremely disappointed, and yeah, out of the three books, this was definitely my least favourite. My most favourite being this one, Gamora and Nebula, because I really love Gamora and Nebula. I love all of these characters. I think it's interesting that like this trilogy is also about like all of my favourite Marvel characters, like at least the anti-hero ones that are so full of possibility, of potential, like especially like you could do so much with them. So that's it for Mackenzi Lee's Marvel trilogy. I will be reading A Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue and A Lady's Guide to Piracy and Petticoats, whatever it's called, at some point in the future, because I do like Mackenzi Lee's writing style. I did, which is why I bought those books, because I wanted to read more of her work. I do like her writing style. I hope that these books are more like Loki and Gamora and Nebula, and not like The Winter Soldier, which is riddled with plot holes. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you've read these books, what you thought of them. Did you like them? Did you hate them? And don't forget to love, share, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.